The letter arrived at dawn, and by breakfast, Blackthorn Manor had already begun to end. Duchess Saraphene Valecroft noticed it first in the silence. No footsteps hurried along the corridors. No maids called to one another over folded linens. Even the clocks in the great hall seemed to tick more slowly, as though the house itself sensed what was coming. She was summoned to the study before she had finished her tea. Inside, the room smelled of pipe smoke and old paper. Her husband, Duke Alaric Ravensmere, stood behind his desk in a black coat buttoned to the throat, his face carved from stone. Beside him stood the estate steward, the family solicitor, and two senior servants who would not meet her eyes. Saraphene entered in her pale silk morning gown, unaware that this single meeting would unravel everything she believed about her marriage. "Sit, if you wish," Alaric said. His voice carried none of its usual warmth. She remained standing. "There is no simple way to say this," he continued. "The shipping ventures I invested in last spring have failed, entirely. The overseas trade route was seized by pirates off the Portuguese coast, and what little cargo survived was lost to unpaid duties. Combined with the debts already owed on the northern estate, we are—" He paused, as though the word itself disgusted him. "Ruined." A servant near the door inhaled sharply. The solicitor lowered his gaze to the papers in his hands, unwilling to witness what he assumed would follow. Tears, perhaps, or fury, or the particular kind of cold silence that wealthy wives reserved for husbands who had failed them. Saraphene said nothing. "Creditors will arrive within the fortnight," Alaric went on. "We must sell 2 of the smaller estates. Most of the household staff will need to seek employment elsewhere, as we can no longer afford their wages." "I am sorry, Saraphene. Truly." Still, she said nothing. The steward shifted uncomfortably. Even Alaric, watching his wife closely from behind his desk, expected some reaction. A gasp, a protest, an appeal to her own family's wealth, anything. Instead, Saraphene's face remained composed, her hands folded neatly at her waist, as though he had told her nothing more troubling than a change in the weather. Then, slowly, she reached up and unclasped the diamond brooch pinned at her collar, the one his late mother had given her on their wedding day, the one worth more than most of the servants would earn in 3 years combined. She crossed the room and placed it gently on the solicitor's desk. "Sell this first," she said, "before you dismiss a single servant. Mrs. Pembury has a daughter recovering from fever. Old Thomas has nowhere else to go at his age. See that they are paid what they are owed, and paid fairly, before anything else is settled." The room fell silent. Alaric stared at her, something unreadable moving behind his eyes. "Saraphene, that brooch was my mother's." "And now it will keep 4 families from starving through the winter," she said simply. "Your mother would have wanted that far more than she wanted it sitting in a velvet box." She turned and left the study without another word, her skirts whispering against the floorboards, leaving behind a room full of people who did not know what to make of what they had just witnessed. What none of them knew, what not even the solicitor or the steward had been told, was that Alaric had orchestrated every word of it. There had been no failed shipping venture. There were no pirates off the Portuguese coast. The Ravensmere fortune remained exactly as vast and untouched as it had been the day before, locked safely in London banking houses, under names even his own solicitor did not fully understand. The ruin was invented, rehearsed, a test conceived many months earlier after a conversation overheard at his club, 2 gentlemen laughing bitterly about wives who vanished the moment fortunes turned, who had married titles and coin rather than men. Alaric had laughed along with them that night, but afterward, alone in his carriage, the laughter had curdled into something colder. A question he could not shake. Would his own wife stay if the coin disappeared? He told himself it was reasonable. Marriages among their class were built on contracts as much as affection, and he had seen enough friends discover too late that their wives had married their houses, not their hearts. He wanted certainty. He wanted proof. Watching Saraphene's retreating figure through the study window as she crossed the courtyard toward the kitchens, her spine straight, her chin lifted, despite what she believed was the collapse of everything she had known, Alaric felt the first small crack of doubt. Perhaps, he thought, her composure was simply a performance of her own. Aristocratic wives were trained from girlhood to mask their true feelings before servants. Perhaps beneath that calm exterior she was already calculating her escape, already drafting letters to wealthier relations, already planning the elegant, unhurried departure of a woman who knew precisely how to leave a marriage without ever appearing to have chosen it. He would need more than one morning to know the truth. He would need to watch her when she believed no one was watching at all. And so, without informing another living soul of his deception, Duke Alaric Ravensmere resolved to let the lie continue, unaware that the woman he doubted had already begun quietly proving, in ways he could not yet imagine, exactly what kind of wife he had married. 3 days had passed since the announcement, and Blackthorn Manor had already become a house Saraphene barely recognized. The dining room, once set nightly with silver candelabras and 3 courses of French cooking, now saw only a single lamp and whatever simple fare cook could manage with a shrinking pantry. The good silverware had been locked away in the strong room, its key entrusted to the housekeeper rather than left hanging on its usual hook. Fires burned only in the rooms actually in use, and the great hall, once warmed for appearance alone, sat cold and dim by evening. Footmen departed one by one, each given a generous character reference and a small parting sum that Saraphene insisted upon, whatever the solicitor's protests about spending what little remained. By the end of the week, only a handful of trusted staff remained at Blackthorn: the housekeeper, cook, 2 maids, and the groundskeeper who had served the family since before Alaric's father died. Among those who stayed was Isolde Whitcomb, a chambermaid of 25 who had attended the Duchess faithfully for nearly 6 years. She had dressed Saraphene's hair for grand balls and sat with her through feverish nights, and she alone among the staff seemed to sense that something about the household's collapse did not sit quite right, though she could not yet say why. What struck Isolde most in those early days was not what Saraphene lost, but what she took on. Rather than retreating to her chambers to grieve her circumstances, as Isolde half expected of a woman raised in silk and privilege, the Duchess rose earlier than usual each morning and made her way to the kitchens before the household had properly woken. She reviewed the dairy accounts herself, correcting an error the previous steward had overlooked for months. She walked the kitchen gardens with the elderly gardener, discussing which vegetables might carry the household through winter with the least expense. She sat with cook over the ledgers, learning which cuts of meat stretched furthest and which supplies in the village might extend credit a little longer. She exchanged her silk gowns one by one for plainer dresses of grey and dark blue wool, practical garments suited to a woman who meant to work rather than simply preside. "You needn't trouble yourself with the accounts, Your Grace," the housekeeper told her one afternoon, clearly uncomfortable at the sight of the Duchess bent over a ledger with ink-stained fingers. "That is hardly fitting work for a Duchess with no fortune left to manage, Mrs. Applewood," Saraphene replied, not unkindly. "Fitting work is whatever keeps this household fed through the winter." Mrs. Applewood said nothing further, though Isolde, standing near the doorway with an armful of linens, caught the older woman's expression, something between admiration and disbelief. Meanwhile, in the privacy of his study, Alaric received quiet reports each evening from his steward, a man he trusted enough to task with watching the household's every small movement, though not enough to tell the full truth of the deception. Alaric had expected, by the 3rd or 4th night, to hear murmurs of discontent, a complaint about reduced meals, a sharp word exchanged with a servant, some flicker of the resentment he had steeled himself to witness. Instead, the reports read the same each time, though the details shifted. Her Grace instructed the gardener to plant more root vegetables for storing through winter. Her Grace sat with the housekeeper past midnight, reviewing which linens might be sold rather than replaced. Her Grace refused a second helping at supper, insisting the servants be fed first. Alaric read each account twice before setting it aside, a strange unease settling in his chest that he could not name. He had built his test on the assumption that hardship revealed a person's truest self, that beneath the silk and manners of aristocratic life, most wives married comfort rather than character, and would abandon a ruined husband as easily as they had once accepted his proposal. But Saraphene had not once mentioned her own family's wealth, though her father, a modest landowner in Kent, could easily have offered assistance had she written to ask. She had not once suggested they might separate, nor hinted that her position had become unbearable. She had simply rolled up her sleeves, in the most literal sense, and set about keeping the household alive. He told himself this proved nothing yet. A woman raised to conceal her true feelings before servants might easily maintain such composure for a week, even a fortnight. True character, he reasoned, only revealed itself under sustained pressure, when hope had thinned enough that pretense became unsustainable. And so, late one night, sitting alone by a fire he had deliberately kept small to maintain the appearance of frugality, Duke Alaric Ravensmere made a decision that would deepen his deception rather than end it. He would let society itself apply the pressure he could not. He would allow word of the Ravensmere ruin to spread through the drawing rooms and afternoon teas of the aristocracy, and watch to see whether his wife's composure survived the judgment of her own class. News travels faster through drawing rooms than through any post road in England, and within a week, all of fashionable society seemed to know that the Ravensmere fortune had collapsed. The invitation arrived on a Tuesday, sealed with Lady Eugenia Wintermere's crest, and written in the sort of elegant hand that made even bad news look decorative. Afternoon tea, it read, at the Hawthorne estate, this Thursday next. Saraphene turned it over twice before setting it aside, knowing full well what awaited her behind such politeness. She almost declined, almost sent word that a headache kept her at home or that household matters required her attention. Either excuse would have been believed easily enough, given her circumstances. But something in her refused to hide, as though hiding might confirm every unkind whisper already traveling through the county. She dressed carefully that morning, choosing her plainest bonnet and a cloak of deep green wool, rather than anything that might once have signaled wealth she no longer possessed. Isolde accompanied her as personal maid, as was proper, though neither woman spoke much during the carriage ride, the wheels rattling over country roads still soft from recent rain. The Hawthorne estate received them with all the warmth of a house that had already decided what to think of its guest. Lady Wintermere's drawing room was crowded with the usual faces, wives and daughters of men Alaric had known his whole life, women who had danced at the Ravensmere's balls and accepted their hospitality without hesitation when fortune still favored the family. Now they arranged themselves in careful clusters, teacups raised like small shields, watching Saraphene's entrance with the particular curiosity reserved for tragedy that has not quite touched oneself. "My dear Duchess," Lady Wintermere said, rising to greet her with practiced warmth. "How brave of you to come." Saraphene allowed herself to be seated near the window, where the afternoon light fell unflatteringly across her plain gray gown, and accepted a cup of tea she had little intention of finishing. The conversation, when it came, arrived sideways, as such conversations always did among people too well-bred for direct cruelty. "One does wonder," murmured a woman named Mrs. Carfax, not quite addressing Saraphene but not quite excluding her either, "how a woman of good family finds herself tied to a ruined name. It seems such a waste of connections." "There is no shame in seeking one's own protection," another added, her eyes flicking briefly toward Saraphene before returning to her teacup. "Many ladies in your position have quietly returned to their fathers' houses until matters improve. No one would think less of you for it." "Indeed," Lady Wintermere said, folding her hands with an air of gentle concern that did not reach her eyes. "A separation need not be scandalous if handled with discretion. Your own reputation, my dear, ought not suffer for your husband's misfortune." Saraphene set down her teacup with a soft, deliberate click against the saucer. "My husband's misfortune," she said, her voice even, "is also my own, Lady Windermere. I did not marry a fortune. I married a man." A brief silence followed, the sort that settles over a room when someone has said something too honest for polite company. "How very sentimental," Mrs. Carfax said at last, with a small laugh that carried no real amusement. Saraphene rose before the laughter could gather momentum. "Thank you for the tea, Lady Windermere. I find I have matters to attend to at home." She left with her chin lifted and her pace unhurried, refusing to grant the room the satisfaction of watching her flee. Isolde followed a step behind, gathering their cloaks from the waiting footman, her own cheeks burning on her mistress's behalf, though Saraphene's own expression betrayed nothing at all. It was only in the carriage, once the Hawthorne estate had vanished behind them along the winding drive, that Isolde allowed herself to speak. "They were cruel to you, Your Grace," she said quietly, "and you did not even defend yourself." "Defending myself would have meant admitting there was something to defend against," Saraphene replied, looking out at the passing hedgerows rather than at her maid. "I have done nothing wrong, Isolde. I will not perform grief or humiliation simply because a room full of idle women expects it of me." Isolde said nothing further, but she watched her mistress carefully for the remainder of the journey, turning something over in her mind that she could not quite name. She had expected tears, perhaps, once they were alone. Some private collapse now that no aristocratic eyes remained to witness it. Instead, Saraphene sat perfectly composed, her hands folded in her lap, her gaze steady upon the passing countryside. It was not the composure of a woman performing strength for an audience. There was no audience left to perform for. And yet the calm remained, untouched and entirely her own. Isolde began for the first time to wonder what exactly lay beneath it, and why a woman so thoroughly humiliated by her own class seemed to carry no bitterness toward the husband who had brought her to this circumstance at all. 4 days after the humiliation at Hawthorne Estate, Saraphene slipped out of Blackthorn Manor alone, telling no one but Isolde where she meant to go, and swearing even her to silence. The village of Ashcombe lay a short distance from the manor, its cobbled street lined with small shops that had served the Ravensmere household for generations. Saraphene walked with her hood drawn close against the autumn wind, a modest cloth bag held tightly in one hand, until she reached the narrow door of Mr. Hargrove's jewelry shop, wedged between the bakery and the saddler's. The bell above the door rang softly as she entered. "Mr. Hargrove looked up from his workbench, his spectacles pushed high on his forehead, and rose at once when he recognized his visitor. "Your Grace, this is an honor I did not expect." "I have come on private business, Mr. Hargrove," Saraphene said, drawing back her hood. "I trust you can be discreet." She placed the cloth bag upon his counter and opened it carefully. Inside lay 3 heirloom bracelets, delicate gold work set with pale sapphires, along with a matching pendant, the last pieces her late mother had left her, kept safe through every season of her marriage, untouched even during the grandest balls of her youth. They were not the Ravensmere jewels. They belonged to her alone, inherited before she had ever worn the Duke's ring, and answerable to no one's approval but her own. "Mr." Hargrove examined the pieces with the careful reverence of a man who understood their worth, both in coin and in sentiment. "These are fine pieces, Your Grace. Are you certain you wish to part with them?" "I am certain," she said, though something tightened briefly in her expression before smoothing away again. "I ask only one thing in return for a fair price, Mr. Hargrove. This transaction must remain between us. Not my husband, not the solicitor, not a single soul in this village is to know of it. Do I have your word?" The jeweler studied her a moment, understanding perhaps more than he let show upon his face. "You have my word, Your Grace." The sum he offered was generous, more than fair for pieces of such quality, and Saraphene did not linger to bargain further. She tucked the small purse of coin beneath her cloak and left the shop with the same quiet composure she had carried into Lady Windermere's drawing room days before. But she did not return directly to the manor. Instead, she made her way to the parish office beside the old stone church, where the local curate kept records of the tenant families still owed wages from the Ravensmere estate. There she settled, in careful and private installments, the outstanding sums owed to elderly Thomas, whose cottage roof had begun to leak, and to the widow Marsh, whose husband had died in service to the estate 2 winters past, and whose small pension had fallen behind. She paid what remained owed to 2 tenant farmers who depended entirely upon Ravensmere land for their livelihood, families who might otherwise have faced the coming winter with empty larders. She left instructions that the money should appear to come from estate funds, never once permitting her own name to be attached to the gift. What Saraphene did not know was that Isolde, sent that same morning to collect thread and ribbon from the village shops, had glimpsed her mistress through the parish office window and had lingered near the doorway long enough to overhear fragments of the exchange, mention of the jeweller's sum, careful instructions about Thomas's roof, quiet reassurance offered to the widow Marsh that her pension would not be forgotten. Isolde said nothing at the time. She gathered her own errands and returned to the manor as though she had witnessed nothing at all. But that evening, alone in the small servants' quarters she shared with another maid, Isolde turned the discovery over and over in her mind, unable to make sense of it. Every lady of her acquaintance in service to the great houses of the county had told similar stories, whispered over shared meals in servants' halls. Wives who fled ruined husbands the moment fortune turned, who protected their own inheritances fiercely and left the wreckage of failed estates to solicitors and creditors. It was simply understood, the way rain was understood to fall in autumn. Yet here was a duchess secretly selling her own mother's jewelry, not to preserve her own comfort, but to quietly pay wages owed by a husband who had, by his own account, ruined them both. She asked for nothing in return. She sought no credit, no gratitude, no acknowledgement whatsoever. She had, in fact, gone to considerable lengths to ensure no one would ever know. Why, Isolde wondered, would a woman go to such trouble to protect a man's honor rather than simply take what remained of her own fortune and leave him to face his ruin alone? It was a question she could not answer, and one that would not leave her thoughts easily. But she resolved, quietly and without quite understanding why, to watch her mistress more closely still, and to say nothing to anyone until she understood the truth of what she had seen. The hunting lodge stood some 3 miles from Blackthorn Manor, tucked into a stretch of woodland the Ravensmere family had used for generations of autumn shooting parties. Alaric had retreated there under the pretense of settling matters with distant creditors, though in truth he simply needed distance from a house he could no longer sit comfortably within. His oldest friend, Sir Edmund Cole, arrived that afternoon at his summons, along with the family solicitor, Mr. Pratt, who carried a leather satchel of papers he had been instructed to bring, but had not yet been told the purpose of. The lodge's single sitting room smelled of wood smoke and old leather. A fire crackled in the hearth, and the 3 men settled into worn armchairs while a manservant poured brandy and withdrew. "You look poorly, Alaric," Edmund said once they were alone, studying his friend over the rim of his glass. "This business with the estate is wearing on you more than I expected." "It is not the estate that wears on me," Alaric admitted, staring into the fire rather than at either man. He had told Edmund the truth some days earlier, unable to carry the weight of the deception entirely alone, though he had sworn him to absolute secrecy. Edmund had listened with the particular silence of a man deciding whether his friend had lost his senses. "Then it is your wife," Edmund said simply. Alaric did not answer at once. He turned instead to Mr. Pratt. "Tell me what you have learned, honestly and without softening it for my sake." The solicitor opened his satchel and withdrew a small notebook, consulting it with the careful precision of a man accustomed to reporting unpleasant truths to powerful clients. As instructed, Your Grace, I made discreet inquiries regarding Her Grace's correspondence and financial dealings over these past weeks. And? She has written no letters to wealthy relations requesting assistance. Her father in Kent has sent 2 letters of his own offering support, which Her Grace declined in her replies, stating that the household's difficulties were being managed adequately. Mr. Pratt turned a page. She has made no attempt to secure her personal fortune beyond the estate's reach, nor consulted any solicitor other than myself regarding her legal position as your wife, which she might easily have done to protect her own interests should matters worsen further. Alaric's jaw tightened. Nothing else? Mr. Pratt hesitated, glancing briefly at Edmund before continuing. There is one matter, Your Grace, though I confess I do not fully understand it. Her Grace has continued reducing household expenses considerably beyond what circumstances strictly require. She has personally negotiated lower prices with 3 local suppliers, taken over management of the dairy accounts entirely, and instructed the housekeeper to sell certain linens and unused furnishings rather than replace worn items. She has done all this, Your Grace, while making no complaint whatsoever, and while consistently ensuring the remaining servants are fed and paid before any other expense is considered. Silence settled over the small room, broken only by the shifting of the fire. She is protecting your pride before the whole of society, Edmund said quietly, setting down his glass. I heard talk of it myself at my club only yesterday. Word has spread of how she conducted herself at Lady Windermere's tea, refusing to abandon you, refusing even to defend herself against those who suggested she ought to leave. Alaric, half the gentlemen of my acquaintance now speak of your wife with considerable admiration, and precious few speak so generously of you. Alaric said nothing for a long moment, his hand tightening around his glass. I did not expect this, he said finally, his voice low. I do not know precisely what I expected. Complaint, perhaps. Some sign that she had married comfort rather than a man. I have watched a dozen friends discover too late that their wives cared nothing for them once fortune faded. I wished only to know the truth of my own marriage before it was too late to matter. And now you know it, Edmund said. Perhaps it is time to end this, Alaric, before the deception causes harm you cannot undo. For the first time since conceiving his test, Alaric felt the full weight of what he had built. The humiliation his wife had endured at Hawthorne, the sacrifices Mr. Pratt's report only partially revealed, the quiet dignity she had maintained through weeks of manufactured ruin. A flicker of shame moved through him, sharp and unwelcome. Yet, even as the thought formed, his pride resisted it. Not yet, he said, setting down his glass with more force than intended. A few weeks of composure prove little, Edmund. True character reveals itself only under sustained hardship, when hope has thinned enough that pretense becomes impossible to maintain. I must be certain. I owe it to us both to be certain. Edmund studied his friend for a long moment, something like disappointment crossing his face, though he said nothing further on the matter. Mr. Pratt closed his notebook quietly, saying nothing at all, though his expression suggested he understood something neither gentleman had yet spoken aloud. That the Duke's test had long since stopped being about the Duchess and had become instead a question of whether Alaric could admit he had been wrong. The old estate archive lay beneath the west wing of Blackthorn Manor, a low stone chamber reached by a narrow staircase that few servants bothered to use. Dust gathered thick upon shelves of ledgers and forgotten furniture, and the air carried the particular must of paper left too long in damp stone. Isolde had been sent there on Mrs. Applewood's instruction, tasked with clearing space among the old storage trunks to make room for furnishings sold off from the unused east rooms. It was tedious work, dragging crates aside and sorting what might still prove useful from what had simply been forgotten, and she had been at it the better part of an hour when her foot caught against something wedged beneath a fallen shelf. A small dispatch box, its wood darkened with age, the lock rusted shut. She might have left it where it lay, another piece of household clutter destined for the growing pile of items to be sold or discarded. But something about its placement struck her as deliberate rather than accidental, tucked carefully behind a stack of old estate ledgers, as though someone had once meant to hide it rather than simply store it away. It took the better part of 10 minutes with a bent hairpin and considerable patience before the old lock finally gave way. Inside lay a bundle of letters, perhaps 24, tied together with faded ribbon that had once been blue. Isolde recognized the handwriting immediately upon lifting the first from its place. Elegant, careful, unmistakably the Duchess's own hand, though younger and less certain than the writing Isolde had grown accustomed to seeing on household notes and correspondence in recent years. Every letter was addressed to the Duke. None of them, judging by the unbroken seals still pressed into several, had ever been opened. Isolde knew she ought to leave them exactly where she had found them, seal them back into the dispatch box, and inform Mrs. Applewood of the discovery so that proper instructions might be given. It was not her place to read private correspondence between husband and wife, whatever curiosity the discovery stirred in her. And yet her hands, seemingly of their own will, had already broken the seal on the letter nearest the top. The date at its head placed it some 4 years earlier, written not long after Saraphene and Alaric's marriage, during a season when the Duke had travelled to Edinburgh on estate business for the better part of 2 months. Isolde read the opening lines with growing unease, aware she trespassed on something private, yet unable to stop herself. My dearest Alaric, I fear I write more honestly to paper than I have yet found courage to speak aloud. I worry, in the quiet hours when the house is settled and I cannot sleep, that I have not yet proven myself worthy of the trust your family placed in our match. You married a woman of modest fortune compared to your own house, and though you have never once made me feel its lesser weight, I confess the fear remains, small and persistent, that I might someday disappoint you. Know this, whatever comes, I would surrender every jewel my mother left me, every shilling of my own inheritance before I would surrender what has grown between us. I did not marry your title, Alaric. I married the man who once sat with me through an entire evening discussing nothing but the stars, simply because he saw I was too shy to speak of anything grander. Isolde's hands trembled slightly as she set the letter aside and reached for another, then another, working through the bundle with growing astonishment. Each carried some variation of the same devotion. Private fears confessed to paper that Saraphene had evidently never found courage to speak aloud, promises of loyalty written years before any bankruptcy, real or invented, had ever entered the household's life. One letter, dated nearly 3 years past, made specific mention of a small inheritance from a distant aunt, and Saraphene's private resolve that should hardship ever befall the estate, she would part with every piece of it before allowing a single servant to suffer for her husband's misfortune. Isolde sat back against the cold stone wall, the bundle resting in her lap, understanding settling over her slowly, and then, all at once. These letters had been written years before the supposed collapse of the Ravensmere fortune. Whatever misfortune Saraphene had feared when she penned them, it could not have been the current crisis, invented only weeks earlier. The devotion within them was not a performance crafted for present circumstances. It was simply who Saraphene had always been, long before there had ever been anything to prove. Isolde understood then why the letters had never reached the Duke. A faded note tucked among the bundle, written in an unfamiliar and shaking hand, explained that old Mr. Bevans, the butler who had served the family for decades before his death 2 winters past, had mistakenly filed them among estate correspondence rather than delivering them, his eyesight failing badly in his final years of service. An accident, then, not concealment, simply an old man's oversight, buried and forgotten until this moment. Isolde retied the ribbon carefully, returned every letter to the dispatch box, and carried it not to Mrs. Applewood, but to her own small quarters, where she hid it beneath a loose floorboard beneath her bed. She did not yet know what she meant to do with what she had found, but she understood, with growing certainty, that these letters held a truth far larger than herself, and that the moment to reveal them had not yet arrived. The announcement came on a grey afternoon, delivered in the same measured tone Alaric had used weeks earlier in his study, though this time the words carried a finality that seemed to settle over the household like a fog rolling in from the coast. "The country estate must be surrendered," he told Saraphene, the two of them standing in the modest sitting room of their London townhouse, to which they had relocated the previous week under the pretense of economizing further. "The creditors will not extend further patience. Blackthorn Manor itself will pass to new ownership by the new year. We shall remain here, in this house, permanently." The townhouse on Chester Street was respectable enough, but it bore no resemblance to the grandeur of Blackthorn. Narrow rooms, a single sitting parlour, a kitchen barely large enough for cook and one remaining maid to work in comfortably. It was the sort of house minor gentry occupied, not dukes and duchesses, and Alaric watched his wife's face carefully as he delivered the news, searching for the crack he still half expected to find. Saraphene was quiet for a long moment, standing near the window that overlooked the narrow street below, where a coal cart rattled past and a costermonger called out his wares to passing servants. "Then we shall remain here," she said finally, turning back to face him. "There are worse fates, Alaric, than a small house with an honest roof." Word of the Ravensmere's complete collapse spread through London society within days, travelling the same drawing rooms and gentlemen's clubs that had once eagerly sought their company. Invitations that had arrived weekly during better seasons ceased entirely. Acquaintances who passed the family in the park offered polite nods rather than conversation, hurrying past as though misfortune itself might prove contagious. Even distant cousins who had once claimed close kinship at every family gathering now found reasons to postpone visits indefinitely. Saraphene bore the silence of abandoned friendships with the same composure she had carried through every previous humiliation. Though Isolde noticed, in quiet moments when her mistress believed herself unobserved, a weariness settling into her shoulders that had not been there weeks earlier. Still, she did not falter in her care for those beneath her. The two remaining servants, Isolde and an elderly cook named Mrs. Furlong, who had followed the family from Blackthorn out of loyalty rather than necessity, found themselves comforted rather than commanded. Saraphene sat with Mrs. Furlong most evenings, discussing what modest meals might still be managed on their reduced budget, never once suggesting the older woman's service had become a burden. She wrote character references, unprompted, for every servant dismissed since the crisis began, ensuring each carried proof of honest service into whatever position they might next find, though she had no obligation left to trouble herself with their futures at all. One evening, as autumn rain beat softly against the townhouse windows, Alaric sat in the small adjoining library, a room barely large enough for his writing desk and a single armchair, working through correspondence he no longer truly needed to attend to. The door between the library and the sitting room stood slightly ajar, and through it he could hear Saraphene's voice, low and steady, speaking with Isolde as the younger woman helped mend a torn hem by candlelight. "Do you regret it, Your Grace?" Isolde asked quietly, her needle pausing mid-stitch. "Marrying into a house that has brought you so low?" There was a brief silence before Saraphene answered, and Alaric found himself leaning slightly toward the doorway despite himself, his pen forgotten in his hand. "I have thought on that question more than you might imagine, Isolde," Saraphene said, "and I find my answer remains unchanged, whatever this house has become. A home shared with one's husband remains a home, whether it possesses 10 rooms or 100. I did not marry Alaric for Blackthorn Manor, nor for silks, nor for a duchess's title. I married him because I believed him a good man, whatever fortune he carried or lost. If I have been wrong in that belief, then I have lost far more than any house. But I do not believe I have been wrong." Alaric sat perfectly still, his pen resting forgotten against the paper, ink slowly pooling into a small dark stain he did not notice. Something in her voice, not performed, not delivered for any audience, spoken simply and honestly to a maid who happened to be near, struck him with a force greater than anything he had witnessed in weeks of careful observation. This was not composure crafted for his benefit. She did not know he listened. She had no reason to believe anyone of consequence could hear her at all, and yet the words came exactly as they might have come had the entire aristocracy of England gathered to witness them. He sat in the small library long after the voices in the next room had fallen quiet, the rain continuing its soft rhythm against the glass, and understood, with a clarity that left him faintly nauseated by his own deception, that he had built an elaborate test to measure a woman whose answer had never truly been in doubt. The only question that remained now was how he might undo what he had done, and whether an apology, however sincere, could ever be sufficient for the cruelty he had disguised as caution. Alaric had made his decision by the following morning. He would end the deception at Blackthorn Manor itself, in the presence of close family and the household staff who had endured the weeks of manufactured hardship alongside his wife. It seemed only fitting that the truth should be revealed in the same halls where the lie had first been spoken, and he arranged for a modest charity supper under the pretense of raising funds for the parish poor, gathering, without their knowledge, the very witnesses to his cruelty and his wife's quiet grace. Word was sent ahead to reopen the manor's ballroom, shuttered for weeks, and Mrs. Applewood oversaw its hasty restoration with visible relief, as though the very air of the house had grown lighter at the prospect of returning to something resembling its former life. Candles were lit in the great chandeliers for the first time since the crisis began. A handful of relatives arrived, Alaric's aunt, an elderly cousin, Sir Edmund Cole standing near the back with an expression that suggested he already knew what was coming and disapproved of how long it had taken to arrive. Saraphene attended in her plainest gown still, unaware of what the evening truly intended, believing it simply another modest gathering for parish charity. Alaric rose to speak once the small crowd had settled, his hands clasped behind his back, his prepared words rehearsed a dozen times through a sleepless night. "Before we proceed with the evening's purpose," he began, "there is a matter I must confess to this gathering, and most particularly to my wife." But before he could continue further, a voice spoke from near the ballroom's edge, quiet but steady enough to carry across the room. "Your Grace, if I might beg your pardon, there is something I believe must be said first." Every head turned toward Isolde, standing near the doorway in her plain servant's dress, a small wooden box held carefully in both hands. Alaric stared at her, momentarily uncertain how to respond to a chambermaid interrupting what he had intended as his own confession, though something in her expression stopped him from dismissing her outright. "Speak, then," he said finally, curiosity overtaking his surprise. Isolde stepped forward into the candlelight, her hands trembling slightly, though her voice remained clear. 3 weeks past, while clearing the old archive beneath the west wing, I discovered a dispatch box hidden behind stored ledgers. Inside were letters written by Her Grace to His Grace, sealed and never delivered, misplaced years ago by old Mr. Bevins before his passing. A murmur moved through the small gathering. Saraphene's expression shifted from confusion to something closer to alarm, her eyes fixed on the box in Isolde's hands. "Isolde," she said quietly, "those were private." "Forgive me, Your Grace," Isolde said, though she did not stop. "I have kept them safe these 3 weeks, uncertain what I ought to do with what I had found. But I believe, tonight, they must be seen." She opened the box and withdrew the bundle of letters, along with a second, smaller collection of papers she had gathered separately, receipts from Mr. Hargrove's jewelry shop, written in the jeweller's own careful hand, and notes from the parish curate confirming payments made to Thomas, to the widow Marsh, to tenant families across the estate. "These letters were written years before the present crisis," Isolde continued, her voice gaining strength as she spoke, "proving beyond doubt that Her Grace's devotion to this family did not begin the day fortune supposedly turned against us. And these receipts prove that in these recent weeks, Her Grace secretly sold her own mother's inheritance, jewelry belonging to her alone, answerable to no one, not to preserve her own comfort, but to pay wages owed to servants and tenants that this household could not otherwise afford. She asked nothing in return. She sought no credit. Almost nobody knew these sacrifices had happened at all, because she never intended anyone to know. The ballroom had fallen entirely silent now, every eye moving between Isolde, the papers in her hands, and Saraphene, whose composure had finally, visibly, begun to crack. "I did not come forward to embarrass her grace," Isolde said, turning finally toward Alaric. "I came forward because I could no longer watch a good woman's sacrifices go unrecognized while the world believed she had married a ruined man out of nothing more than obligation. Whatever truth your grace intended to reveal tonight, I felt this truth needed to be spoken first." Alaric stood motionless, the confession he had rehearsed all night suddenly inadequate against what had just unfolded before the entire room. He had come to this ballroom prepared to admit his own deception, to explain that the bankruptcy had never been real. Instead, he found himself confronted with proof of a devotion far deeper and more selfless than even his elaborate test had managed to uncover. Sacrifices made not for his benefit, not for any audience, but simply because his wife believed them right. "Saraphene," he said, his voice barely steady, "is this true?" She did not answer at once. When she finally spoke, her voice carried none of the composure she had maintained through every previous trial, but something rawer, closer to grief. "You built a test to measure my loyalty," she said quietly, understanding dawning across her features as the pieces of recent weeks arranged themselves into a shape she had not previously allowed herself to see. "While I had already spent years proving it, without you ever once needing to ask." The truth, once spoken, could not be unspoken, and Alaric did not attempt to soften what remained to be said. He stepped forward into the candlelight where Isolde still stood, the letters and receipts held between them like evidence at a trial, and faced the small gathering of relatives and servants who had come expecting a modest charity supper and found instead the unraveling of a household's greatest secret. "Everything my wife has endured these past weeks was built upon a lie of my own making," he said, his voice carrying to every corner of the ballroom. "There was no failed shipping venture, no pirates off the Portuguese coast. The Ravensmere fortune has remained entirely intact since the morning I first announced its ruin. I invented this crisis to test whether Saraphene would remain loyal to a man with nothing left to offer her, or whether, like the wives of certain acquaintances I once envied for their caution, she would abandon me the moment my title lost its coin." A gasp moved through the gathered relatives. Sir Edmund Cole said nothing, having known the truth for weeks already, though his expression carried the particular weariness of a man relieved to see a long-overdue reckoning finally arrive. "I was wrong to doubt her," Alaric continued, turning now to face Saraphene directly, the rehearsed words of his earlier confession abandoned entirely in favor of something rawer and less composed. "I was wrong to stage a cruelty and call it caution. You never once tested me, Saraphene, in 6 years of marriage. You never once questioned my honor, nor demanded proof of my devotion before offering your own. And I repaid that trust by manufacturing suffering to satisfy a doubt that was never truly about you at all. It was about my own fear of being loved for the wrong reasons." Saraphene said nothing for a long moment, the letters Isolde had uncovered still resting on the small table between them, evidence of a devotion she had never intended anyone to witness. When she finally spoke, her voice trembled slightly, though whether from anger or something gentler, even she seemed uncertain. "You let me believe our servants would starve," she said quietly. "You let me sell my mother's jewelry in secret, believing it necessary. You let Lady Wintermere's circle humiliate me over a ruin that never existed." "I did," Alaric admitted, offering no defense, no softening explanation. "And I will spend a good deal longer than this evening earning back what that deception cost you, if you will permit me the chance." Whatever remained unresolved between them that night was not settled in the ballroom before the eyes of relatives and servants alike. Saraphene excused herself quietly once the gathering had absorbed the full weight of the revelation, and Alaric did not follow, understanding that some wounds required solitude before they could be addressed honestly. But in the days that followed, back at Blackthorn Manor, Alaric set about undoing the damage of his deception with the same thoroughness he had once applied to constructing it. He established permanent pensions for every servant who had served the household faithfully, ensuring old Thomas and the widow Marsh would want for nothing in their remaining years, whatever fortune the estate carried forward. He wrote personally to every dismissed footman and maid, offering restored positions to any who wished to return, with wages increased beyond what they had previously received. And before the assembled household, he appointed Isolde Whitcomb as the Duchess's personal household secretary, a position of trust and standing far beyond what a chambermaid might ordinarily hope to attain, in recognition of the honesty and courage she had shown in bringing the truth to light, rather than allowing it to remain buried. It was several days more before Saraphene and Alaric walked together through the manor gardens, the last warmth of early spring sunshine breaking through clouds that had lingered stubbornly through the preceding weeks. Alaric wore his riding coat, having returned from a morning survey of the estate's northern boundary, and Saraphene had chosen a gown of pale blue silk, the first she had worn since the crisis began, as though permitting herself, finally, to set aside the plain wool that had become her armor. "I built my fortune on a title I inherited," Alaric said, as they walked the gravel path between beds of early crocuses pushing up through the last of the frost. "But it was you who rebuilt my honor, Saraphene, in ways I did not deserve and cannot fully repay." "I do not require repayment," she said, though something in her tone had softened considerably since the ballroom. "I require only that you never again mistake my silence for indifference, nor my composure for a performance requiring an audience." "I understand that now," he said, "more clearly, I think, than I have understood anything in a very long while." They walked on together in a silence that no longer carried the weight of duty or obligation, but something quieter and more honestly earned. Two people who had faced the worst assumptions each might have harbored about the other, and found, beneath every layer of manufactured hardship, a devotion that had never once required testing at all. For the first time since their wedding day, Duke and Duchess Ravensmere walked as husband and wife alone, bound not by title or contract, but by a trust that neither deception nor scandal had managed, in the end, to break.